One of the things I missed most last year during the midst of the pandemic was the Olympic Games. We were set to have a summer Olympic Games that's been postponed to this coming summer, if you didn't know that already. But Olympic athletes are kind of a special breed of human beings. It takes essentially a lifetime of practice and dedication and perfection and training just in the hopes to get a chance to try out for the Olympic team, let alone to make it. If you do happen to make the Olympic team, if you're one of the fortunate few who get to do that, well, then you find yourself up against the best athletes the world has to offer. So your chances of winning become even more slim. And so if by some means you are able to be triumphant and you get to win the entire Olympic Games in your sport, you get a prize that is so incredibly rare for every athlete, a chance to stand on the top podium, to receive a gold medal, and to hear your national anthem blaring out across the PA. All that work and that striving and all the endurance that it takes in order to do that, it's no wonder why every time you see an Olympic medal ceremony, whoever gets the gold medal is almost always overcome with emotion. But for Kurt Angle, his Olympic dreams seemed like they were never even going to get off the ground in the first place. Kurt was a highly skilled amateur wrestler, specializing in men's freestyle. He'd been wrestling since about the age of 7. He'd always developed a love and a passion for it from a very early age. But Kurt never really even considered himself to be hopeful for the Olympics at a young age. He never dreamed of it. He just enjoyed wrestling because it was something fun for him to do. Kurt was the youngest of 6 from a low-income family in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His family was not exactly wealthy. They were not well-to-do, but he was the youngest, again, of 6, and that included 4 older brothers. Kurt didn't consider himself to be the best athlete in his own family, let alone a potential best athlete in the world. He started in such a humble beginnings, yet he developed a determination and a passion for wrestling. When Kurt first entered into high school, he began to show flashes of the brilliance that was later to come. As a freshman in high school, Kurt went undefeated, one of the only members of his high school team to be able to do that, including some seniors. As a sophomore, Kurt actually qualified for the state wrestling competitions. But it was during his sophomore year that Kurt would face the first of his most incredible challenges. Kurt's father, a crane operator for a local construction company in Pittsburgh, died tragically in a freak accident. And Kurt and his father were very close, and so the loss of his dad affected Kurt in such a huge and emotional and impactful way. And so wrestling, this thing that he enjoyed doing, became an escape for him. It became something that he could do to take his mind off of the pain that he felt at the loss of his father. He rededicated and refocused himself to his sport. As a junior in high school, Kurt placed 3rd in the state wrestling competitions, going incredibly farther than any other member of his wrestling team. And as a senior, Kurt finally accomplished his dream at that point in time. He was the state winner of Pennsylvania's men's freestyle wrestling. It was a huge accomplishment for himself, and it opened up an opportunity for Kurt that he never thought he'd be able to have. It gave him a scholarship to go to college. Kurt went to the Clarion University of Pennsylvania. And while he was there, he remained completely and solely focused on wrestling. He trained for hours at a time. He kept his grades up somehow. He didn't know really how because he didn't really study all that much. But he's so focused on wrestling, he would sometimes train for 6 or 7 hours a day. And if you can think back to your own college days, I can tell you that is something that is really hard to do, to give 6 or 7 hours to anything outside of class. And yet Kurt remained focused on that. When he finished college, Kurt was a 2-time Division I NCAA wrestling champion, a 1-time runner-up, a 3-time Division I NCAA All-American. Not only did Kurt show promise in wrestling, but during this point in time, he was actually being scouted by coaches and trainers and sponsors of Olympic hopefuls. Suddenly, the idea of wrestling in the Olympic Games was starting to become more of a reality for Kurt. He knew that if he wanted to continue on in the world of wrestling, he would need more than just focus and determination and intensity. He needed to have a coach, someone who could inspire him and encourage him to keep going and to keep his focus on what was the goal ahead. It was then that Kurt met a man by the name of David Schultz. The name may sound familiar to some of you. David Schultz was the Olympic gold medal for men's freestyle wrestling in 1984. He was hugely successful, and in Schultz, Kurt found not just someone who has a kindred spirit or somebody who could inspire him, but for the first time since his father's passing, Kurt found someone who he considered to be a father figure. The two men grew incredibly close over a very short amount of time. They trained upwards of 10 to sometimes even 12 hours a day in the hopes that Kurt could make the Olympic team. Schultz constantly pushing him and inspiring him and encouraging him to keep going and to keep giving it his best. Even when he was so tired, all he wanted to do was just collapse on the mat and go to sleep. Schultz continued to push him. In 1995, Kurt won the gold at the FILA Wrestling World Championships in Atlanta, Georgia, where the very next summer, the Olympic Games were set to take place. As Kurt stood on that podium and received the gold medal, he envisioned himself on a similar pedestal, receiving a similar gold medal this time next year. He was excited. He couldn't wait. He was anticipating greatness in his future. But not long after that, Kurt would suffer another devastating loss. In January of 1996, just a little over 6 months before the Olympic Games were set to begin, just a little under a month before Kurt was set to participate in the Olympic tryouts, the sponsor of the qualifiers coming from the camp of David Schultz, a man by the name of John Alaruth DuPont, shockingly, surprisingly, murdered David Schultz in cold blood. And now Kurt faced the second greatest loss of his life. Not just a coach, but his friend, his mentor, his father figure. And Kurt didn't really have the time to mourn for David. But he did find a way to refocus himself. He said that he was going to make the Olympic team, he was going to win the gold medal, and he was going to do it to honor his friend, to honor David Schultz in his memory. Kurt first had to find another team to be a part of for obvious reasons. But he participated in the Olympic qualifying games in February of 1996. And when he was there, he found himself in a room full of people just like himself, people who came from all over the country, from all different backgrounds and all different economic backgrounds and all different kinds of ways that they were brought up, but all hoping for the same thing as Kurt. And so Kurt knew it was going to take more than just focus. It was going to take a little bit of luck on his part, too, to make the games. But he was confident. He was confident in what he'd experienced in the past. He was confident in what David had taught him. He knew for a fact he was going to be able to make it. But his first match didn't exactly go that well. In his first match, with just a little under a minute left to go, Kurt found himself down 3 points to nothing. And whenever he was attempting to do a takedown on his opponent, Kurt landed awkwardly on his neck. And he felt a shocking pain go throughout his entire body. Somehow, during the last 50 seconds of the whole entire match, Kurt was able to turn it all around and ended up winning 4-3. Meaning that Kurt was now officially a part of the Olympic team. As Kurt finished up the match, he went over to the doctors and told him, something doesn't feel quite right. So the team doctors actually had him go and get x-rays and have an MRI and even a CAT scan done to make sure they could figure out what was going on. And it was there that Kurt learned something that not only was going to derail his Olympic dreams, but possibly derail any dream he ever had in his life ever. When Kurt landed awkwardly on the mat, he managed to fracture 2 cervical vertebrae, he herniated 2 other discs, and he pulled 4 muscles all in his neck. Doctors told him he was frankly lucky to be walking, and that he was going to require a surgery that was going to take him over a year of rehab in order to be able to just live a normal life. They encouraged him that maybe you can try again in 4 years. But the problem was Kurt was already 27 years old, and he knew that 4 more years, it wasn't real likely he was going to make the team to be able to participate. So Kurt explored other options. But the only other options, because of how strict the Olympics were about what you could put in your body and what you could do to alleviate any sort of pain, meant that Kurt had to spend the next 5 months dealing with the pain of a broken neck every single day. When the Olympics began, Kurt would have a doctor every day, just before he began his warm-ups, inject him with the only Olympic-approved pain reliever that he could find, enough just to keep him going to shut out the pain in his mind. But he was determined. He was going to win a gold medal. He was going to do it. He was going to focus solely on this whole idea, shutting out everything else that was going on. He'd receive his injections, he'd do his warm-ups, he'd have the match, and then surely as soon as the match was over, that pain reliever was starting to wear off. And so Kurt, unlike a lot of the other Olympic teams, didn't go off and do any partying. He didn't go off and hang out with anybody else. Once his matches were over, Kurt went back to his hotel room and sat perfectly still for hours, waiting for the pain to subside, enough for him to get some uneasy sleep. But he kept going. He kept fighting. He kept his focus. And he kept winning. Finally, Kurt found himself in the gold medal match of the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia. He was staring across the mat at an Iranian by the name of Abbas Jadi. The two men wrestled. Kurt described it as the hardest match of his life. The two men wrestled for 8 minutes to a draw, which meant it had to be a judge's decision because you can't have 2 gold medals. The judges deliberated for a few minutes. Kurt described it as the longest few minutes of his entire life. And then the judge came across the loudspeaker and declared, Kurt Angle, the youngest of 6 from Pittsburgh, whose father died when he was 16, whose coach died just 6 months beforehand, and who broke his neck just 5 months ago, was now an Olympic gold medalist. He'd achieved his dream because he stayed focused. He was determined. And even when everything else around him seemed like it was crumbling, he just kept going. Maybe that's where we're different. See, over the last several weeks, we've been talking about the necessity and the idea of persistence in our faith. We've been talking about what it means to just keep going. We've identified that persistence is incredibly difficult for us. But if I may, maybe the reason why persistence becomes so difficult for us is because we are far too easily distracted. We lose our focus all the time. It's not really hard to see why. I mean, the world around us has so many different things going on a daily basis, one catastrophe right after another. So maintaining that focus is difficult, but the reality of it all is that we have Christians, an entire generation of Christians, who seem hopeless, who seem to have lost perspective, who seem to have lost focus. We need to refocus. We need to recalibrate. We need to have that persistence in our faith. And at its heart, I think that's the point of our text today. We're going to eventually land in Joshua chapter 24. So if you got your Bible or your app or whatever, open it up to Joshua chapter 24. Put your thumb in it. Like we've done so many other times throughout this entire series, we're going to be a little bit all over the place to start off with, but we're going to get there eventually, I promise. But let's talk a little bit about how we got to Joshua 24. As you may recall, last week we discussed the Israelites finally escaping their slavery from Egypt after 400 years. We talked about all the ways that had to happen, and that this generation of Israelites got to see God do some incredible things, that without a doubt, they got to see God in control of everything, and that God had a true, genuine care and affection for them. He protected them. He guided them. We saw the 10 different plagues taking place in Egypt. We saw the Red Sea being parted. We saw God even showing up for them in small ways by raining down bread every morning and providing fresh quail every night. This generation got to see God in control in so many different ways. And that's why it was so surprising that when they finally reached the promised land, when they finally were on the outskirts of the land that God had promised their father Abraham, so many years beforehand, God told them this was going to be their land. But they got scared. They lost focus. And they didn't feel that God was in control. This meant that now this generation who had seen God do so many different things, they'd seen God show up in big ways and in small, They would not be allowed to see the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise. They would not be allowed to enter into the promised land. Instead, they would spend the next 40 years wandering in the desert until all but 2 of that generation had died. The only ones allowed to see the promised land were Caleb, if you recall from last week, our intrepid 8th grade boy. At least I'm convinced he was an 8th grade boy. And Joshua, the protege of Moses. But when the last of that generation finally died off and they're about to go entering into the promised land, before that had ever happened, they had something tragic happen. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 5 tells us exactly what had happened. It said, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the Lord's word." I want you for a moment just to kind of think about what this might have meant for these people. For a lot of this generation of Israelites, this second generation, if you will, who are about to go enter into the promised land, for most of their lives, and in several cases, probably their entire lives, Moses was the only leader they'd ever known. He was it. When they were kids, Moses was the one who got them out of Egypt in the first place. He was the one who went and talked to God and would relay the messages of God to them. And whenever God laid out his commandments, Moses was the one who dictated them to the people. Moses had always been the figurehead of their entire lives. If they could remember a time before Moses, it took a significant effort on their part because he had been their leader for so very long. Many of this generation were probably born along the way or born during their wandering. And they'd only ever known Moses as their leader. And now they are standing on the precipice of doing something incredible. And the only leader they'd ever known has died. I mean, yeah, everybody knew that Joshua was the obvious choice to take over for Moses. He'd been Moses' protege for all this time, so he made the most sense. But still, it was hard to comprehend a life and a world without Moses. But Joshua was resolute. He was going to inspire his people. He was going to push them. He was going to guide them. He was going to help them to focus on the task ahead. After the period of time was over for the Israelites to mourn for Moses, Joshua knew it's time to get to work. And before they ever entered the promised land, Joshua wanted to remind them of one simple thing. He wanted to refocus them on what was most important. He reminds the people of what their real focus ought to be in Joshua chapter 1, verse 13, where he says, "Remember what Moses, the Lord's servant, commanded you when he said, 'The Lord your God will give you rest, and he will give you this land.'" If they could focus in on the promise of God and do as God has commanded them to do, this land is theirs. That God has been with them all this time, God's going to be with them over here. If we can stay focused on him, it's going to be ours. I'm telling you, folks, that's a pep talk. If you're not getting a little amped up right now, you might want to get some more coffee in the morning. They're excited. After that, this generation of Israelites got to see God do some incredible things, many of which, dare I say, were even more impressive than the generation behind or before them got to see. See, before they were able to go to the first city, the city of Jericho, they sent in a couple of spies to just kind of go and scout ahead and figure out what's their best way to attack here. But the problem was those spies were found out. The government of Jericho discovered that there were spies wandering around their land, and they almost caught them. They were so incredibly close, but the 2 men were saved at the very last minute by the last person in the world you'd ever expect to save them, a prostitute by the name of Rahab, a citizen of Jericho herself. When the time came for them to actually go into Jericho, there was a small problem. See, there was this thing that was in the way of the people in the city of Jericho. It was called the Jordan River. And I don't know if you know this about rivers, but rivers tend to move. If you're not careful, it's easy to get swept up in the current and carried on down. So God decided to intervene again to show that he was, in fact, in control. He had them take the Ark of the Covenant ahead of them. And the priests that carried it, once their toes hit the water split. And they crossed on dry ground. Seems familiar. Maybe for some of them, this all seemed like a distant memory. When they crossed over, instead of directly going and attacking the city of Jericho, they did something entirely different. For 6 days, they marched around it. Which, I'm sorry, if you're a citizen of Jericho and you just see this whole crowd of people just marching around your city, that's weird, right? Am I the only one who thinks that's a little strange? Like if all of a sudden there was like a whole big crowd of people just marching around our church this morning? That's weird. You do you, I guess. But then on the seventh day after they completed their march, they did something incredible. They launched into their attack, but their attack was not exactly orthodox. See, all they did was make noise. They blew trumpets, they screamed at the top of their lungs, they stomped their feet. Not exactly a great military action, and yet the walls of the city of Jericho fell. I want you to think about this for a second, okay? They knocked down the walls of a huge city by yelling at it. I could probably go and yell at this brick wall over here until I can't yell anymore. And nothing, right? I mean, all of you are going to probably have some men in white coats take me away once my voice is gone. But that's what they did. They knocked down an entire city by screaming at it. Crazy. It wasn't like things were easy for them, though. It wasn't like they were just able to keep going, and it wasn't like they maintained this rock-solid focus the entire time. In fact, they got a little selfish. They did something that God had told them not to do. God told them to get rid of all possessions and all livestock of this city. And the Israelites did, frankly, what I probably would have done and said, well, I don't want to waste all that stuff. And they kept some. And because of that, when they went to go fight the next battle at a land called Ai, they suffered a devastating loss. Hundreds of Israelite men were killed because for a split second, they lost their focus. But Joshua gathered the people together. He once again reminded them of what's at stake, once again reminded them of what they needed to focus on and where their attention needed to be. And from that point on, city after city fell. From that point on, inch by inch, they overtook the land that God had promised them all the way back to Abraham. And finally, after everything, after all the dust settled and the smoke cleared, it was theirs. The promise was fulfilled. The Israelites had been persistent. They kept their focus. And because of that, it was all theirs. This place that God had promised generations ago to Abraham, a man who was in his late 70s, a man whose wife was barren, was told he's going to be a great nation, that great nation was going to be in the land that Abraham was now living in. It was finally here. You got to think that there were nights when they were kids that their parents would tell them stories about Abraham and tell them stories about how one day God was going to give their people this land, that one day they were going to overtake this entire place and this was going to be theirs because God had said so. Not for a second dreaming that they were going to be the ones to take it, and yet now here they are standing in the literal promise of God fulfilled. Because generation after generation, they remained persistent. They kept their focus. And finally, after everything that came beforehand, they saw the promise of God fulfilled. It paid off. They were now standing in their reward. But Joshua, who had by this point in time proven himself to be a great leader, possibly on par with Moses, knew that even though they had done exactly what God had said, even though they'd kept their focus in this moment, that it was just as important that they keep their focus beyond it. That even though things were fantastic right now, things might be different tomorrow. So Joshua gathered together his people one last time. As they're standing in the promised land, they were addressed by their leader one final time. We see it in Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15. Chances are you know at least part of this. It's a verse one of these verses is so familiar to us that we just know you could probably recite it without me having to read it to you. But here's what it says. He said, "Therefore fear the Lord. Worship him in sincerity and truth. Get rid of the gods of your ancestors that they worship beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and worship the Lord. But if this doesn't please you to worship the Lord, choose for yourselves today which you will worship. The gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're now living. But as for me and my family, we will worship the Lord." Joshua knew that even though they'd kept their focus to get to this point, even though they kept their focus on God and his promise all this time, he knew that it was just as important to remain focused beyond this. That it'd be so easy for them to get comfortable and get complacent and lose focus on God. Joshua himself had seen God move in so many different ways and had seen God in control in all these different ways, knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God cared about his people. And so Joshua resolved to refocus and to keep himself and his family dedicated to the sole purpose of serving God. Persistence is not easy for any one of us. It's not. Maintaining your faith in what's going in the world that we live in is incredibly difficult for us to do, myself included. It's something that we all struggle with, something that we all wrestle with, something that we have a difficulty to maintain. We know that we need persistence. We understand that Scripture calls for us to be persistent, and yet it's hard. I think that one of the biggest reasons why persistence in our faith is so difficult for us is because it's too easy for us to lose focus, for us to become distracted by the things of this world. It's no wonder why. I mean, look what happens in the world around us on a daily basis. We get so caught up in news cycles and gun violence and political issues and marital problems and pandemics and conspiracy theories and protests and talks of war and a million other things. We know that as Christians, as the followers of Jesus, we are called to be in the world, but not of the world. But how do you maintain that mindset when the world around you is metaphorically and sometimes literally burning to the ground? How do you keep your focus when everything around you is chaos? Is it any wonder why so many Christians seem so hopeless? Folks, we need to refocus. As followers of Jesus, we need to refocus. As the church, we need to refocus. And I think we do that by following the words of Joshua. See, I don't think it was any coincidence, I don't think it was on accident that Joshua said, "Choose for yourselves today." The connotation that Joshua gives us there is that you need to make that choice daily. And for some of us, we don't make that choice daily. For some of us, we're lucky if we make that choice weekly. And yet Joshua reminds us it needs to be a daily choice on our part as to who we're going to serve and where we're going to put our focus. As Christians, we have to choose to focus on God daily, to seek Him out, to seek out what He wants, to focus on what's important to Him, and to drown out everything else that's going on around us. And the obvious question becomes, well, how do we do that? And I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little blunt. Some of you may not like me very much for this, but you know how to do this. You know that it requires taking time every single day for things like prayer and things like scripture and things like worship and all this other stuff. I'm probably not the first guy who's ever told this to you. I'm probably not the first guy who stood on this stage and told this to you. But what do? We make excuses. Well, I was going to pray, but then the news said that this had happened. And I got caught up in it. I was going to read scripture, but then this thing happened. I was going to do this, but I was going to do that, but stop making excuses. Just do it. How can you possibly hope to be persistent in your faith if you're not taking time out of your day to focus? If you don't know what it is that you're striving towards, how can you possibly keep going towards it? Every day we need that reminder to take just a few moments of every single day to just focus in on God. To drown everything else out for just a moment and reconnect with Him. Because if we keep our focus, if we know what it is that we're striving towards, then persistence is going to come naturally to us. If we genuinely want to see persistence happen in our faith, if we genuinely want to see ourselves drawing closer to God on a daily basis, in spite of what is happening in the world around us, it happens when we just take a moment to refocus. That breaking story is still going to be there in 5 minutes. That huge and important thing that's happening halfway across the world, you can wait a couple more minutes to know about it. That hugely important thing that you need to go do first thing in the morning, it can wait 5 more minutes. Your boss may not like it if I say this, but you can be a little bit late to work if it means that you spend a few minutes focusing in on what really matters to you. We have to stop making excuses if we want to be persistent in our faith. Not taking the time to refocus would be like trying to lose weight but going every day to a bakery. It'd be like trying to run a marathon but forgetting your shoes. It's not going to go well. If we continue to make excuses as to why we can't refocus ourselves every day, we're going to continue to find persistence to be a struggle. That doesn't mean that just because we take those few moments to focus in on God that it's all going to come easy for us. I wish that's the way life worked, but it doesn't. But it at least allows us an opportunity to keep at the forefront of our mind what's most important, what really matters to us. And if we claim to be Christians, if we claim to be followers of Jesus Christ, well then what could possibly be more important to us than focusing in on Him and chasing after what He wants from us? If we remain persistent, we'll find that God is going to show us His faithfulness. We'll discover what our true nature and true character is from Him. We'll be able to live between the promise and the fulfillment of God. And we'll know that even when all of it seems so chaotic, God is still in control. It's hard to keep going and keep fighting and keep growing if you don't know where to put your focus. So take some time. Turn off your phone. It has a power button. Mine's right here on the side of it. Maybe turn off the talking heads. You could probably do a break from the news anyway. And just focus in for a few moments every day. Make that choice. Choose for yourselves today. And then tomorrow, choose for yourself again. And then the day after that, and the day after that. If we want persistence in our faith, it all comes down to who you choose to follow today and where you choose to put your focus. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 says this, and we're going to close with this morning. It says, therefore, Since we also have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. If we focus in on Jesus, we're going to find it a lot easier to just keep